When Jerusalem fell, everyone said the same thing. Babylon won. Israel lost. The temple was stripped. The king was humiliated, and the brightest young people were marched away like trophies in a parade. If you only had ground-level vision, that is the whole story. A small nation tried to resist the superpower of its day and failed. Their God must not have been strong enough to protect them. Their faith must not have been practical enough to stand up in the real world. But the book of Daniel refuses to tell the story that way. It pulls the camera back and says, "No, that is not what happened. Babylon did not overpower Israel's God. Israel's God allowed his people to go into exile." That is a very different way to read a national disaster. It means the future is not in the hands of the empire. It is still in the hands of God. That is the first gift Daniel gives to believers who live in hard places. Exile does not mean God is absent. Exile means God is moving his people into the middle of the world he wants to reach. The Babylonians thought they were collecting talent. God was planting witnesses. The Babylonians thought they were re-educating young minds. God was positioning faithful people inside the system so that when he spoke, there would already be someone in the room who knew his voice. That is why Daniel opens not with prophets in the desert or priests at the altar, but with 4 young men in a foreign training program. That is God saying, I can work in the temple and I can work in the palace. I can work in Jerusalem and I can work in Babylon. Geography does not limit me. That truth matters for believers today. A lot of Christians assume that when their culture stops honoring God openly, God has somehow been pushed out. They think if the laws change, or the media shifts, or the majority no longer respects Christian convictions, then God has been moved to the sidelines. Daniel says the opposite. God is not nervous when his people are outnumbered. God is not confused when his people lose home field advantage. God can teach faithfulness in Jerusalem. He can also teach it in Babylon, in Persia, in Greece, in Rome, in any modern nation that thinks it is the final word in history. Exile does not cancel God's rule. It exposes it. There is also a cleansing honesty to the way Daniel begins. It tells us that God will sometimes let his people feel the consequences of their long disobedience. Israel did not end up in Babylon by accident. The prophets had warned them for generations about idolatry, injustice, and stubbornness. They ignored God when they were strong. Now God will teach them to listen when they are weak. That is not God abandoning them. That is God loving them enough to let them see that every other foundation crumbles. Sometimes the most merciful thing God does is remove the illusion that we are secure without him. But notice this too. God does not send everyone into exile and tell them to hide. He sends some of his people right into the center of the machine. 4 young men with Hebrew hearts and Babylonian assignments. That tells us something practical. God does not only need preachers. He needs believers in government offices, university departments, media companies, hospitals, tech firms, military bases, neighborhood associations, school boards. He needs Daniels in places where decisions are made and where proud people reach the end of their wisdom. If you belong to Jesus, and you work inside a system that does not honor him, do not assume you missed your calling. You might be standing exactly where God wants you to stand. So the first pillar of this whole book is simple and strong. God is still on the throne even when his people are not. God can plant faithful witnesses inside hostile cultures. God can make exile serve his plan. And for American believers who sometimes feel like the ground is shifting under their feet, this opening scene is supposed to steady you. Your influence in the culture rises and falls. Political winds change. Court decisions change. What is celebrated and what is mocked changes. None of that has ever dethroned God. He is the one who moves his people into place. He is the one who decides when to speak to a king. He is the one who keeps covenant even when geography, language, and power structures all change. If he could do it in Babylon, he can do it where you live. When we first meet these 4 young exiles, Babylon is doing what every dominant culture tries to do. It is not enough to conquer your land. It wants to conquer your mind. So it changes their names. It enrolls them in its schools. It feeds them from the king's table. It surrounds them with images of power and success until they start to say to themselves, "Maybe this is who I am now." That is how empire works. It does not always force you to bow with a sword. Sometimes it feeds you into forgetting. It offers you comfort, status, language, and opportunity, so that one day you wake up and realize you still believe in God privately, but you belong to Babylon practically. Daniel and his friends saw what was happening, and they drew a line that looks small, but is spiritually massive. They decided not to defile themselves with the king's food. Out of all the compromises they could have fought about, they chose a daily bodily practice. Eat this, not that. Start here, not there. It almost feels too minor for people who just lost their nation. But this is an important pattern in the spiritual life. Loyalty to God is not proved only in spectacular moments. It is formed in ordinary habits. These young men were saying, "You can change our address. You can assign us Babylonian literature. You can call us by Babylonian names. But you cannot touch the part of us that belongs to the Lord. Even in Babylon, we will eat like people of the covenant. Even in Babylon, we will remember where we came from." God met them right there. The text says, He gave them favor with the officials. He made them healthier than the others. He sharpened their minds, and He gave Daniel a particular grace to understand dreams and visions. That is not random. God was preparing His people for the exact kind of crisis that was about to hit the empire. Before the king ever had a troubling dream, God had already put a dream interpreter in the palace. That is what faithfulness does. It positions you so that when the world runs out of answers, you are already close enough to speak for God. Then the first big test of Babylonian confidence arrived. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that shook him so deeply he could not sleep. Think about that. The man who could command armies and rebuild cities could not command his own heart to rest. Power can rule nations. It cannot rule nightmares. He called in all the empire's experts, the people who were supposed to have a line to the gods, and he made an impossible demand. Tell me the dream and the meaning. He did not want performance. He wanted revelation. And in one stroke he exposed how empty human wisdom is without the God who reveals mysteries. These men could spin interpretations, but they could not see into the hidden place. They had influence, not insight. When Daniel heard that all the wise men were about to be executed because the king was furious, he did not panic. He did not launch a rebellion. He did not write a bitter speech about how unfair the empire was, even though it was. He asked for time, and then he gathered his friends to pray. That is what the people of God do when culture faces something it cannot explain. They do not just criticize the culture. They seek mercy from the God who rules history. They ask, "Lord, tell us what you are doing. Show us what no one else can see." And in the night, God showed Daniel the dream. The dream was a statue made of different materials: gold, silver, bronze, iron, mixed with clay. Beautiful, impressive, towering. That is how human empires look from the ground. But then, a stone, not cut by human hands, struck the statue on its weak spot, and the whole thing shattered. The stone grew and filled the earth. Daniel stood before the most powerful man alive and said what most people would be afraid to say. God gave you this kingdom. After you will come other kingdoms. None of them will last. But the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Daniel did not insult the king. He honored him, but he refused to worship him. He served the empire without belonging to it. That is the balance American believers also have to learn. You can work, vote, build, lead, and bless. You can be excellent at your job and gain real influence. But you cannot give to any human power what belongs to God. Stock markets, political parties, military alliances, corporations, even nations themselves are statues with feet of clay, real weighty but fragile at the bottom. They can be toppled by things no one saw coming. God's kingdom is the stone. It looks small. It does not look as glamorous as gold, but it is the only thing in the vision that survives. Daniel chapter 1 and 2. Together teach a timeless survival skill for people of faith living in powerful cultures. Draw small daily lines of loyalty to God. Stay near other believers. Pray when the world is in crisis. Speak truth with respect when you finally get the ear of those in power. Remember that your career is not the final kingdom. Remember that your nation is not the final kingdom. Remember that God plants his people inside systems so that when the statue starts to wobble, there is someone there to point to the stone. Eventually, the empire did what empires always do. It stopped being satisfied with obedience and started demanding worship. Nebuchadnezzar built a massive image and ordered everyone to bow when the music played. This is how worldly power tests loyalty. It is not enough that you work for the state, or pay your taxes, or contribute to society. You must honor what the culture honors. You must bend when the culture says bend. You must agree that what everyone else is doing is normal. Most people in Babylon probably told themselves the same little story. It is only one moment. It is only on the outside. God knows my heart. But 3 Jewish officials knew this was the line they could not cross. You can rename us. You can promote us. You can dress us in Babylonian clothes. But you cannot have our worship. Their answer to the king is one of the clearest pictures of mature faith in the whole Bible. Our God is able to deliver us from the furnace. But even if he does not, we will not bow. Notice the 2 parts. Our God is able. That is confidence in the power of God. But even if he does not, that is surrender to the wisdom of God. They did not say, if God does not rescue us, he has failed. They said, if God does not rescue us, he is still worthy. That is the kind of faith that keeps people standing when everyone else is kneeling. It is the kind of faith American believers are going to need more and more. Not a faith that says God must do what I want, when I want, or I am out, but a faith that says God can. God may not. Either way, I am his. The king was furious and ordered the furnace overheated. The soldiers who threw the men in died from the heat. That should have been the end of the story. 3 faithful men gone. But God was making a point to Babylon and to every generation that would read this book. The king looked and saw a 4th figure walking in the fire with them, and the fire had not even singed their clothes. They came out without the smell of smoke. The same king who demanded worship now had to confess that the God of these exiles was higher than the gods of Babylon. God did not just preserve their souls, he preserved their bodies. He was saying, I can keep my people faithful in the hottest places. But Daniel 3 is careful. It does not promise every believer in every era that God will always pull them out at the last second. Sometimes God glorifies himself by delivering. Sometimes God glorifies himself by sustaining. The point is not, if you are brave enough, you will always be spared. The point is, bowing to idols is not an option for the people of God, even when it is costly, even when it is lonely, even when you could explain away compromise by saying, I need to keep my position to do good. The 3 men did not negotiate with obedience. They did not say, I will worship once publicly and repent later. They said, our allegiance is visible. Our worship is not for sale. This is where the story speaks right into our cultural moment. We live in a time when many of the idols are not golden statues. They are narratives, ideologies, social expectations, business practices, and entertainment habits that say, everyone normal does this. If you want to be included, just nod, just repost, just sign, just endorse, just laugh, just stop talking about what the Bible says so clearly. And many Christians are tempted to say, it is just one thing. It is just one ceremony. It is just one corporate statement. God knows my heart. Daniel 3 says, be careful. The empire tests loyalty through worship. What you bow to shapes who you become. One more thing this story gives us is a picture of presence. God did not stand outside the furnace and shout encouragement. He joined them in the fire. That is important for believers who are paying a price right now for staying faithful. Maybe you lost a promotion because you would not lie. Maybe friends pulled back because you would not celebrate what God calls sin. Maybe family thinks you are extreme because you put Jesus above culture. Daniel 3 says, you are not alone. The Son of Man meets his people in the place of pressure. He does not only reward faithfulness later, he walks with them in it now. So in this third movement of the book, we learn another core lesson. Powerful cultures will eventually want your worship. Mature faith trusts God's power and God's freedom. Obedience is not something we hide just to make life easier. And God is able to make even fiery trials become places where his presence is clearest. Empires want you to think safety comes from bowing. Daniel 3 shows the opposite. Safety comes from belonging to the God who stands in the flames. Power looks impressive from the outside, but in Daniel, the most dangerous thing about power is what it can do on the inside. In chapter 4, we meet Nebuchadnezzar again, only this time the crisis is not a dream he cannot remember. It is a dream he does remember, but does not take seriously. He sees a great tree that shelters the nations, a beautiful picture of a king whose influence reaches far. Then a messenger from heaven says, cut it down. Leave the stump. Let him live like an animal until he learns that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he will. Daniel hears the dream and is distressed because he knows exactly what it means. He tells the king plainly, your power is real, but it was given to you. Use it with humility and justice. Stop oppressing the vulnerable. Take your success as an opportunity to honor God, not yourself. God is warning you before he humbles you. Nebuchadnezzar heard the warning. He even admired Daniel's insight. But the message did not get down into his bones. That is another thing power does. It makes people think warnings are for other people. A year later, he was walking on the roof of his palace, admiring the city he had built, and he said the quiet part out loud. Is not this the great Babylon I have built by my mighty power, and for the glory of my majesty? In that one sentence, you can hear the shift. It is no longer God gave. It is I built. It is no longer God is glorious. It is my majesty. And right then, the word of God fell. The man who ruled men could no longer rule himself. His reason left him. He lived like a beast until he lifted his eyes to heaven and confessed that God's kingdom is the only kingdom that lasts. Daniel 4 is not just a strange story about an ancient king acting like an animal. It is a theological mirror. It shows what happens to human authority when it disconnects from worship. When leaders forget that their authority is delegated, not inherent, they start to act less human and more beastly. They devour instead of serve. They make everything about their name instead of God's name. They use strength to secure themselves instead of to protect the weak. God graciously warned Nebuchadnezzar. God also restored him when he finally looked up. That is the hopeful side of the chapter. God is willing to humble in order to heal. He will bring down a proud person if that is what it takes to bring them back to sanity. The next chapter shows the same lesson, but in fast forward and without the happy ending. Belshazzar, a later Babylonian king, threw a drunken party and decided to mock Israel's God by bringing out the cups from the temple. He drank from what was holy and praised idols that could not see or hear. In the middle of the party, a hand appeared and began writing on the wall. All the noise in the room could not cover the terror of that sight. The king's knees knocked. The wise men could not explain it. So they called for Daniel, the old exile, who still carried the presence of God. Daniel's words to Belshazzar are even sharper than his words to Nebuchadnezzar. You knew what God did with the previous king. You knew how God brought him low and restored him. You knew that the Most High rules. But you did not humble yourself. You exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. Therefore your days are numbered. The message on the wall said it all. You have been weighed. You have been found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to others. That very night, Babylon fell. No long illness, no slow decline. Just a line from heaven, and the empire changed hands. Put Daniel 4 and 5 together, and you get a pattern God wants every generation to remember. God is patient, but he is not blind. Power without gratitude will be confronted. Leadership without humility will be interrupted. Nations that use what is holy as decoration for their pride will be judged. That was true in Babylon. It was true in later empires. It has been true again and again in history. And it will be true for any modern nation, institution, church, or leader who begins to believe that success came from themselves and for themselves. God gives kingdoms. God can take them back. This matters for believers who live under leaders who seem untouchable. Daniel is saying, no human ruler is the ceiling of history. They are all accountable. They are all weighable. They are all temporary. Sometimes God warns and restores, like with Nebuchadnezzar. Sometimes God warns and judges swiftly, like with Belshazzar. Either way, God is not wringing his hands while proud people strut. He is watching. He is measuring. He is deciding when to act. Our job is not to panic when arrogance sits on the throne. Our job is to stay faithful, to keep speaking truth respectfully, and to remember that the kingdom above all kingdoms does not belong to the loudest voice of the moment. There is also a word here for anyone God has trusted with influence. Maybe you lead a church, a business, a team, a classroom, a nonprofit, a growing online platform. Daniel 4 and 5 are telling you ahead of time what God values. Authority is to be carried with worship. Success is to be stewarded with justice. Credit is to be sent upward, not swallowed. The moment you start to say, "Look what I built," and you stop saying, "Look what God allowed me to do," you are stepping onto the roof with Nebuchadnezzar. The safest place for any leader is on their knees, remembering that the Most High rules, and that we are most human when we know we are not God. After Babylon fell, you might expect Daniel to fade into the background. New empire, new rulers, new staff. That is how human systems work. When the administration changes, the old people are pushed out. But one of the quiet themes in Daniel is that human kingdoms change and God's servants stay. Daniel had served under Babylon, and now he was serving under Medo-Persian rule. He was older, but he was still excellent, still trustworthy, still praying. That combination always attracts two things at once. It attracts favor from above and jealousy from people. The new king liked Daniel. The other officials did not. They looked for corruption in him and could not find it. So they did what people often do to believers who are both upright and effective. They attacked the only place he would never compromise, his life with God. They convinced the king to sign a law that for 30 days no one could pray to any god or man except the king. On paper, it sounded like loyalty. In practice, It was an attempt to criminalize what Daniel did every day. A lot of us, if we are honest, would have started strategizing right there. We would have said, "It is only 30 days. I can pray silently. I can pray at night. I can close the windows. I can wait. God knows my heart." Daniel did not play those games. The text says he did what he always did. He went home, opened his windows toward Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day. He let his rhythm with God stay public. For him, obedience was not a private hobby. It was visible allegiance. That is such an important word for modern believers. We live in a time when faith is often pushed to the private sphere. Believe what you want, just do not bring it into public. Keep prayer at home. Keep the Bible out of work. Keep Jesus out of policies. And many Christians have slowly accepted the idea that the safest faith is the hidden faith. Daniel 6 pushes against that. He was not rude. He was not loud for the sake of being loud. But he refused to make his devotion to God invisible just because the state was uncomfortable with it. He kept doing what he always did, because what he always did was right. The plot worked. Daniel was arrested. Notice what God did not do. God did not stop the officials from spying. God did not keep the law from being signed. God did not send an angel to tell Daniel to go into hiding until the 30 days were over. God let the sentence fall. That can be hard for us. We want faithfulness to prevent hard things. Daniel 6 shows us that sometimes faithfulness walks you right into the hard thing. The king who liked Daniel suddenly realized he had been tricked, but he could not undo the law. So Daniel was lowered into the lion's den. A stone was placed over it. From the outside, it looked final. The man who prayed is now in the place of death. But God meets his people in the place of death. He sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. The animals that should have devoured him could not touch him. The king could not sleep. That is such a reversal. The man in the palace with all the comforts tossed and turned. The man in the den with lions rested under God's protection. Early in the morning, the king ran to the den and called out in hope. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you?" And Daniel answered. He was alive. The one who had stayed faithful in public was vindicated in public. And then something remarkable happened. The pagan king preached the sermon Israel was supposed to preach. He declared that the God of Daniel is the living God, and his kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. That is the heartbeat of Daniel 6. Empires come and go. Laws rise and fall. Administrations change. But the God who listens to exiles and closes lions' mouths is not going anywhere. Faithfulness is never wasted, even when it costs. Public obedience can look risky in a culture that does not share your convictions, but it is exactly that kind of steady, unembarrassed devotion that God loves to honor. Daniel did not start being faithful when it got dramatic. He had been faithful for years. The lion's den was just the place where everyone finally saw what God had been seeing all along. For believers in any nation, this chapter is both a comfort and a challenge. The comfort is that God can protect in the most impossible places. The challenge is that God expects us to keep our windows open toward Him, even when it would be easier to close them. Do not reduce obedience to something you do only when no one is watching. Let your loyalty to Jesus be the kind of ordinary, predictable rhythm that people around you can count on. Pray because you always pray. Tell the truth because you always tell the truth. Worship because you always worship. And leave the lions to God. Up to this point, the book has mostly told stories about faith under pressure. But in chapter 7, the camera lifts. We are no longer watching Daniel interpret the dreams of pagan kings. We are watching heaven show Daniel how history actually looks from above. What he sees is not flattering to human empires. He sees four great beasts coming up out of a chaotic sea, each one different, each one powerful, each one frightening. That is already a statement. When human kingdoms run on pride, violence, and self-worship, they stop looking like the image of God and start looking like animals. They can build roads and libraries and armies, but underneath, there is something devouring about them. They eat the weak. They boast about their strength. They talk as if they will live forever. This vision would have helped every exile who ever wondered, why does God let these beastly systems keep running? Daniel is being shown. They do not run forever. They run on a leash. Their rise is real, but it is temporary. Their claws and teeth make a lot of noise, but they do not set the end of history. Human beings, when they forget they were made to rule under God, start to rule like beasts. That was true of Babylon. It would be true of Persia. It would be true of Greece. It would be true of Rome. It has been true of every later empire that confuses success with divinity. Then the scene shifts upward, and everything changes. Thrones are set in place. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. His clothing is white like snow, his hair like pure wool, his throne flaming with fire. It is a courtroom, but it is also a coronation. Rivers of fire flow. Countless angels stand before him. The beasts are judged, and their power is taken away. In other words, history is not random. It is supervised. The Most High God watches beastly kingdoms and decides when they are done. That is supposed to steady believers who live during the loud part of the beast's life. Just because the beast is roaring now does not mean it will roar tomorrow. But the most surprising part is still coming. Daniel sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Unlike the beasts, he is human. Not beast-like, not hybrid, not distorted. Human the way humans were supposed to be. And to him is given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. If chapters 1 to 6 ask, can you be faithful inside a hostile empire? Chapter 7 answers, yes, and not only that. One day, God will take the rule of the world away from beastly empires and hand it to a truly human ruler and to his faithful people. That line about the saints sharing in the kingdom is easy to skip, but it is one of the most hopeful sentences in the book. God is not only going to judge bad governments. He is going to restore human rule to the people who stayed loyal when the beasts were loud. The wise, the steadfast. The ones who would not bow to idols. The ones who prayed with their windows open. The ones who walked in the furnace rather than betray God. God says, those are the people I trust with my world. Daniel 7 is telling exiles, you are not wasting your time by being faithful. Heaven is watching, and heaven is planning to make your faithfulness permanent. This vision also sets up something huge for later. Centuries after Daniel, Jesus of Nazareth would keep calling himself the Son of Man. He was not picking a humble nickname because he was shy. He was picking the title from Daniel 7. He was saying, I am the truly human ruler. God promised the one whose kingdom will not end, the one who will receive worship from every nation. So when we read Daniel 7 today, as Christians, we read it with double clarity. We see what Daniel saw, that empires become beasts. And we see what Daniel could only glimpse, that Jesus is the Son of Man, coming on the clouds, and that our loyalty to him now is our participation in his future rule. For believers living in any nation, this chapter teaches us how to read the news. Do not be impressed just because a power is loud. Do not be seduced just because a system looks unstoppable. Do not be crushed just because your faith makes you look small. Heaven has already ruled on how the story ends. The beasts do not get the last word. The human one does. And he shares that word with his people. After Daniel saw that sweeping courtroom in heaven, you might think the story would wrap up neatly. Beasts judged, Son of Man exalted, saints sharing the kingdom. But God did something Daniel did not expect. He pulled the curtain back further and showed him that history would not move in a straight, clean line from exile to restoration. There would be more waves, more empires, more arrogant rulers, more pressure on God's people. Daniel had been reading the prophet Jeremiah about 70 years of exile, and he was probably hoping, like most of us would, that after the 70 years God would fix everything at once. Bring the people home, clean up the world, close the story. Instead, God told him, I will restore, but the plan is bigger than you thought. In chapter 8, Daniel saw a ram with 2 horns pushing west and north and south, doing whatever it pleased. That was a picture of the Medo-Persian Empire. Then a male goat with 1 strong horn came from the west so fast, its feet did not touch the ground. That was Greece under a powerful leader. The goat shattered the ram. The great horn was broken, and 4 horns rose in its place. Out of one of them came a little horn that grew arrogant and attacked God's people and even his sanctuary. In other words, future empires would keep repeating the same pattern Daniel had already lived through. Rapid rise, impressive power, hostility toward true worship, pride that tries to climb into God's space. This was heavy for Daniel. He did not treat prophecy like trivia. He felt it. He got sick. He mourned. So in chapter 9, he did the only wise thing to do when God shows you how long and complicated the story will be. He prayed. Not a quick help me prayer. A long, humble covenant prayer. He confessed the sins of his people. He reminded God of his promises. He asked God to forgive, to restore, to make his face shine again on his ruined sanctuary. That is an important detail. Even a man as gifted as Daniel still took God's hard words back to God. He did not complain about how unfair it was. He interceded. God's answer was both comforting and stretching. He sent an angel to tell Daniel that yes, God had heard him. Yes, God would act. But the unfolding of the promise would take longer than 70 years. There would be more decrees, more rebuilding, more opposition, more desecration, more waiting. Exile was not just a date on the calendar. Exile would be a season in history. That was not God breaking his word. That was God enlarging it. He was saying, I am not only rescuing one generation from one empire. I am writing a plan big enough to deal with every beast that will ever rise. I am aiming at final righteousness, not just temporary relief. This is such an important word for modern Christians, because we are used to fast solutions. We want God to fix our nation in one election cycle. We want him to heal our church in one revival weekend. We want him to change our families in one dramatic moment. Sometimes he does move suddenly, but often he lets us live in the long middle, the part of the story where there is some homecoming, but not all the way, some rebuilding, but with opposition, some freedom, but with pressure. That does not mean he has forgotten. It means his answer is bigger than our lifetime. Waiting is part of faith. Daniel shows us what to do in that kind of season. We pray even when we know the story will outlive us. We confess even when the culture is not confessing. We stay loyal in small things, even when we do not see the big victory yet. We keep our eyes on the God who planned the 70 years and the God who planned the longer road after the 70 years. We let his timeline humble ours. And there is another layer God showed Daniel in chapters 10 and 11. Behind human politics, there is real spiritual conflict. Daniel had been fasting and mourning for 3 weeks, when a radiant heavenly figure appeared and told him that from the first day he prayed he had been heard, but the prince of the Persian kingdom had resisted in the spiritual realm. Angels were fighting. Messages were being delayed. History was not just kings making decisions. It was contested space with dark powers trying to block God's purposes, and God sending help. That is supposed to adjust how we see long, complicated seasons. It is not always that God is slow. Sometimes there is opposition we cannot see. So this seventh movement of the book teaches us to live with holy patience. Empires will keep acting like empires. Arrogant leaders will keep showing up. Worship will keep being pressured. But God is not improvising. He told Daniel ahead of time so that exiles would not lose heart when the 70 years passed and the world was still messy. If life does not get fixed on your timetable, it does not mean God forgot. It means His promise is aimed higher than your comfort. He is writing a story big enough to end beastly kingdoms everywhere, not just to make one corner of history easier for one small group of people. Daniel was an old man by the time we reached the last stretch of the book. He had watched kings rise and fall. He had seen Babylon come and go. He had served faithfully under a new empire. He had received visions that were so intense they made him weak. But the full restoration of God's people and God's city had not appeared yet. That is where a lot of believers eventually find themselves. You have walked with God a long time. You have seen Him answer in real ways. You have proof that He is faithful. And yet some of the things you prayed for have not happened. Some of the promises look far off. Some of the brokenness you thought would be healed is still there. Daniel felt that. So he fasted. He mourned. He kept seeking. God answered not just with comfort, but with perspective. He showed Daniel that what is happening on earth is tied to what is happening in the unseen realm. Princes of empires resist God's purposes. Angels are sent to fight. Messages are delayed, but not denied. History is not random. It is contested. That means two things at once. First, the opposition you feel is real. Second, it is not final. God's messengers get through. God's decrees stand. God's timetable holds. So even when you cannot trace every detail in the news or in your personal life, you can trust that a real battle is being fought, and your prayers are part of that battle. Then God gave Daniel a long, detailed outline of future kings and wars and betrayals, and at the center of it, one especially arrogant ruler who would exalt himself, desecrate what is holy, and persecute God's people. It is sobering to read. It tells us plainly that there will be seasons when evil seems organized, well-resourced, and temporarily successful. But even that figure, as terrifying as he looks, only prospers for a set time. He is on a leash, too. At the appointed time, God judges. That is the steady drumbeat of Daniel. Beastly power does not go unnoticed. Pride in high places does not go unchallenged. God watches. God waits. God acts. Right in the middle of these heavy visions comes one of the most hopeful lines in the whole Old Testament. The wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. That is God's way of talking to exiles, to minorities, to faithful churches in hard places, to believers who feel small in loud cultures. Your faithfulness is not invisible. Your work in teaching, discipling, parenting, pastoring, serving, suffering, staying clean in a dirty industry, keeping prayer alive in a prayerless office, all of that will shine. Not for 15 minutes, forever. Empires roar and die. Fame comes and goes. But the people who help others walk in God's ways will glow in God's future. The book ends in a way that sounds almost gentle compared to the beasts and wars and fire and lions. Go your way, Daniel. Rest. You will rise at the end of the days. That is God talking to an old servant whose life has been long, whose assignment has been heavy, and whose eyes have seen more than most people see. It is also God talking to every believer who will not live to see everything they prayed for. Keep walking. Do your assignment. You may not see the whole promise in your lifetime, but you are part of a kingdom that cannot be destroyed. The end is not you holding everything together. The end is God raising you up into His finished future. For Americans hearing this today, that is an important recalibration. We live in a culture that wants everything now. Instant victory, instant clarity, instant influence. Daniel tells us we belong to a God who makes promises across centuries, who weaves nations and angels and churches and families into one story, who lets His people live inside empires without belonging to them, and who guarantees resurrection at the end. Empires rise, roar, and die. God's kingdom does not. Our job is to stay faithful in the middle, to keep praying with the windows open, to refuse to bow when the music plays, to speak truth respectfully to power, to wait when the 70 years are up and the world is still messy, and to hear at the end the same personal word Daniel heard. Go your way. Rest. You will rise.